What's up, everybody? I'm Blessed and Free. Welcome back to another episode of DOC TV Unleashed. So, if you haven't watched anything yet on this channel, I bring people on that have been to prison, that have lived a crazy life to share their story on everything that they went through. If you could, man, this is a new channel. Hit that like button, subscribe, turn your post notifications on so every time I do drop content, you can hear it first. So, if you guys don't recognize the guest I have on today, his name's Tommy. He did 28 years in the California prison system, and he has a shit ton of crazy stories. Tommy, go ahead now. You could just introduce yourself, tell the people just a little bit about yourself, and then we can go ahead and start.
My name's Tommy, obviously Tommy Trauber. Grew up in a small town, northern California, or central coast of California, Santa Barbara County. Northern end's called Santa Maria. Did over 28 years in prison, as you talked about. I went to prison at 17, did over 28 years, got out when I was almost 46. Uh, it was a crazy adventure for sure, you know.
And for the people that are tuning in for the first time, the California prison system runs a lot different than a lot of other prison systems because basically it's based on your race, right?
Yeah. Oh, it's completely segregated. And, we do that to ourselves. Don't get me wrong. It's not like something the cops did or whatever. We chose to segregate ourselves by race. You know, I've watched a few YouTube videos about people who talk about going to prison and being, and the racial structure. And, they're going to get a lot of comments about, yeah, there are some whites that do run with the blacks. But for a long time, and the rules have changed on that in recent years where they're allowing it, I guess, from what I understand. I haven't been there. So, but previous, it was a no-go. You couldn't run with the Northerners. You couldn't run with, eh, the Northerners was a shaky one. Sometimes they let them, sometimes they wouldn't. It depends. But definitely no blacks, no whites could run with the blacks. I mean, it was so bad. There would be white guys running with the blacks coming out with pictures of their family members say, look, I am black. I'm just mixed. You know what I mean?
Like
So
it's
that they wouldn't get,
validation.
yeah, like, so we wouldn't move on them. They would come to us first and say, hey, just so you know, I am black. I just don't look it because, I'm only a quarter or whatever, right? They would say, my mom's half black or my dad's half black, and that was enough for us as long as, we could, satisfy that, like, okay, dude's, all right, he's at least a little bit black. We can, but for the most part, man, if you were white and you ran with the blacks, it was pretty much done. You know
So,
what I
do
mean?
you know anything about the Florida prison system?
Zero. I mean, I watched the video that you put on with another guy that I
Yeah.
did time with and talk a little bit about some of that stuff, but I don't know anything about it, man.
Yeah. So, in Florida, man, like a white guy can be a blood, a Latin king. I mean, I've never seen a Nieta, but it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know if you even know what that is. That's like a
I
Puerto
don't.
Rican. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
Nietas are like Puerto Rican gang. Latin kings are like Latin, obviously. Um, and well, there's white boys in all of those. So, California, that's just not really happening when you were in prison.
No. I mean, you'll see some whites running with the Southsiders, the Sureños. You'll see some whites running with the Norteños. But that's about it, right? And it's not real prevalent. I've heard people on here talk about like they were from Southsider gangs on the streets and they go to prison and become white boys, you know what I mean, stay with their race or whatever. And I
Mhm.
knew a guy, matter of fact, I talked about it in the first video. The very first guy that I ever celled up with that had just got out for murdering his cellie, he was actually from a Southsider gang before he had went to prison. And in the 80s, it wasn't as common. Whites didn't run with Mexicans back then, period, for the most part. But when he had first come into the prison system, and that's not always true either, because Joe Morgan, one of the biggest founding members of the MA, was a white guy. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? That grew up in the
that's
barrio,
true.
right? So, it was rarer then than it is now, obviously. But, he decided to run with this race because when he went to prison, it wasn't as accepted as it can be, later on, as far as running with the Sureños goes. Norteños, same thing. There was a few, and I will say this, man, the whites that ran with the other races, from my understanding, and, from an outside perspective looking in, they seem to have a harder road to hold than the other, like the Mexicans, right? If a Mexican is from a Mexican gang, that's typical. White dude from a Mexican gang comes in there, he has more to prove. You know what I mean?
Right.
So there's more for him to have to do.
In the
No,
dorm in California, like you'll never see a black, a Mexican, and a white at the same table playing spades or like making a
no,
goulash or whatever. None of that.
no, no, no. No. You'll see a white and a Mexican Southerner doing it, right? You'll see them, partaking in sharing of food and stuff like that, right? Because we're allies. You know what I mean?
Right.
And I'm hearing that things have started to change as far as being the Northerners being a part of that. So now it's a trio instead of a duo. Um, the Paisas, the Mexican nationals, they're part of the Sureños in prison. So, we can share and break bread with them, but we weren't allowed to break bread with the Northerners, the others, or the blacks. The other thing changed sometimes, like depending on what prison you were at, because sometimes the others, shared our bars or shared our part of the day room, right? I'm talking about like the Vietnamese. Anybody that's not white or Mexican or black kind of gets thrown in that other category, with the exception of the American Indians, right? So, and the American Indians used to run with the whites until I want to say like the early 2000s. We lived with them, we programmed with them, but they separated themselves because we were constantly at war with other races and on lockdown, and they didn't really want to be a part of that.
Do you
So
think
they kind of
it'll ever be in California where it's not segregated like that, where everybody's mixed together?
I think it's going to be very difficult, man, because it's been such an established part of the correction system so far. I mean, I can't remember when there was a moment where it wasn't, right? Now you got the S&Y yards where it's not like that. People live with whoever they live with, right? But as far as like the GP, I don't know, man. I think that the gangs are so entrenched and they have so much control over the population that, you know what I mean? I really don't think it's going to happen. Not anytime soon. Not maybe not in my lifetime. If it does, there's going to have to be a serious change into how the organized, associates, how they operate in the system, right? They're somehow or another, they're going to have to be removed and then no contact. You know what I'm saying? But you know how impossible that is because, First Amendment right, you get mail no matter what. You know what I
Right.
mean? Even
Yeah.
if they have to put it on a video screen, you're still getting mail. You're still getting communication. You're still allowed visits. I mean, there's always going to be a way to communicate to the streets and then back to another facility. And as long as that's going on, man, you hard pressed to change that, man. Hard pressed.
What's the craziest norteño you ran across during your whole time?
I don't know. See, Norteños were very secretive, right, about who their structure was, right, who their upper echelon was, right, and very like because I was white, I didn't really, I wasn't allowed involved in their stuff. They didn't like come communicate with me about, oh, we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that, or But there was a
The
guy named
reason I'm asking this is because in Florida, like when you're in prison, there's so many prisons, right? And you'll be at a prison and you'll hear like, man, there's this dude J Rock over at Sumter CI,
yeah,
and that white boy's knocking shit out or he's stabbing everything
yeah.
he's seeing.
So
Do you hear that kind of stuff going on in
yeah, we
California?
kind of do, right? Like there was a guy named Kukui, right, which is like boogeyman in Spanish, right? He
That
was a
fool's
killer.
crazy.
He was a killer, bro. And I watched him put in a couple of different works. I mean, a couple of times I've seen him put in work, man. And I tell you what, that dude he was vicious, bro. And when they say ride him to the dirt, Kukui was literally riding dudes until they weren't moving anymore. And then afterwards he would, say something crazy in
What was that
Spanish or
saying?
in Azteca. I don't know. He would say something in like Azteca, like, and he'd look up at the sun and, like basically like he was, you
Sacrificing
know,
your ass right
yeah.
there.
I mean, the
That's
dude was a,
crazy.
what's funny though? It's like they always say those are the nicest guys. I love that dude. You know what I mean? He was my neighbor for the longest time, and me and him had some of the best conversations, man. And not about prison. You know what I mean? About politics, about things are going on in society, about fishing, about you name it. And we would have some of the best conversations. But when it came time for him to do his job, he did it with
He did
zeal.
it.
You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Yeah, like he wasn't playing. And he was probably the craziest northerner. Um, there was a few southerners, man, that were, with the business. There was a dude from Santana, man, he was with the business too, bro. He would, but with them, the thing about them that the ones that I found to be the most craziest were the ones that were in the shoe. The big homies, the dudes that were tipped up, right? And not because I seen them do stuff, but I seen the amount of power that they have, right? With just a look, with
Can
just
you
a
just,
word.
yeah, can you describe to the people that may not understand what you mean about the
So
power?
like, so in California, for the longest time, for 40 some years, if you were a validated gang member, validated prison gang member specifically, right? One of the big three, Aryan Brotherhood, North, NF, or the MA, you were locked into the shoe, period, indeterminate shoe. You weren't really getting out without debriefing, dying, or paroling, right? Those were the three things. Those are the only three ways out. So there was one guy. I'm not going to put his name out there. Like I said, I try not to use these guys' name just because I ain't trying to put myself in a situation
Right.
with them either, right? But there was a particular dude, and people know who I'm talking about. He would come out to the yard. So in the shoe we got these little cage yards. So individually, you go into a cage, and you got a bunch of guys in cages next to you or behind you, right? So there's like 15 cages in the front, 15 cages in the back, or something like that. I don't remember the exact number, but it was a lot of them, right? And that's how you interacted with these guys. This guy, man, there was this kid in there who had recently showed up, and this all he did was look at the kid said something stupid, right? And the guy just looked at him, and he looked over at his cellmate, because at the time you got cellmates, right? So, and the cellmates went to the yard with you, and by the end of that yard, that kid was getting beat, and it was just with the look. Didn't even have to say anything. Just looked at him, gave him the nod, and looked back at the kid, and that was it. You
What does
know,
this dude look like that gave the nod? Like, what are we
He's a
looking?
little short dude. He's a little tiny old man with big ass glasses, big black. Well, they remember the birth control glasses they used to call them,
Yeah,
like the big,
yeah, the
but
Chomo aviators is what I call
yeah, he had the big Mexican brochure, big Mexican, but little short dude, man. And ironically, that dude ain't no good no more, but he controlled so many people. You know what I mean? He controlled, like, just with, like I said, a nod, with a look, and people feared his name. You know what I mean? Like, oh, you bring up his name, you were like, people were quake. I mean, especially Southerners. Whites, not so much. We had a respect for him, right? But at the same time, he didn't have the same. We had our
power.
own guys. We had our own guys that had that same amount of power. You know what I mean? That with just a word, your career was over.
Can you
You know what I mean?
recall any one of those on the that was like on the woodpile?
Oh yeah, there was. I mean, I can name names, right? I mean, just there was Blinky. I mean, he passed away recently, but him, Stenson. I mean, as far as the white goes, they were the upper echelon of that organization, man. And you know what? With just a simple word, man, there was, a huge clash going on between different rivals within that organization, and that caused a lot of problems, But those people still had a tremendous amount of power, man. When their name came up, you didn't use their name unless you had permission. You know what I mean? And if you better have permission, because if they find out you didn't, you were done. I'm not talking like a little bit done. They were going to send 4 or 5 guys after you at once, you know, with knives. And I'm not talking like little tiny pokers. I'm talking 8, 10 inches of steel that you cut off your lockers. You know what I mean? Kill that dude. Because if you don't, then the guy that ordered it, if that guy don't get annihilated, then the guy that ordered it's in trouble. You know what I mean? Because you didn't do it good enough. You didn't have it done good enough. So it was bad. But on the same token, those are the same guys that, like, they were nice guys, man. And I hate to say that, right? They were super calm, they were super collected, and they didn't make moves that were based off of, like, um emotion. It was well calculated. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
was part of that.
They didn't
So
just react immediately.
no.
Yeah.
And you know what? And sometimes, man, it was stupid. Like, I had a really good friend of mine, man, and he was my very first cellmate in prison. He was in there, had just came out for murdering. When he went back to the shoe for killing somebody, and then when he was in the shoe, they ordered him to kill his cellie, and he did. And the problem, it was over a baseball game, man. An argument over a baseball game with one of
Wow,
those real
that's
powerful
great.
dudes. You know what I mean? And that was it. It was over an argument over a baseball game. The dude said he gave him a run and he didn't, right? Or whatever, right? So the gambler, like, oh, you owe me money because I won. No, you gave me a run. No, I didn't give you a run. Blah, that kind of thing,
Right.
right? A little
Stupid shit.
argument. And a week later, this dude's asleep permanently. You know what I mean? And it's like, you see that stuff, man, and you're like, fuck, man. Sometimes that power, that corruption of that power, you know what I mean, is absolute, like they say. And So that, those are the times when, I think that was the first time when I was in that situation, when I was watching all that stuff go down, where I realized that like it wasn't about race. Race is just a controlling factor, right? For the whites. Whites don't have gangs. We're not Bloods. We're not Crips. We're not Sureños. We're not Norteños, right? We don't have that as an identifying factor. All we have is our race. We come from big cities. We come from small countries. You know what I mean? Like small parts of the state, real rural counties. From anything in between. And when you come into prison, if you're not from a gang, you don't really know what to identify as. Well, you're white. You're coming here. You know what I mean? And they use that, man, to really control. That's how you control people, right? Is you give them something to identify as. You're not a Sureño, you're not a Norteño, you're not a Blood, you're not a Crip, you're not a whatever. You're white. So that was it. I realized they didn't really care about race. They care about power and control. You know what I mean? So it was just one of those factors that they used.
Yeah.
And well, I'll tell you this, right? This is what happens when you step out of bounds. There was two guys. I'm gonna name them, right? Because they're PC'd up anyway. Right? There's a guy named Story and Rebel, right? Story that's his last name, Story, but he went by that too. Um, Story was one of those guys that, and there's different arguments about what kind of person this was, but anytime that dude got into debt, he would find somebody to stab, right? So
To
there was a
check
guy
in.
put in. No, he would stab somebody. He would just find somebody to stab him. He would make up a reason, and he needed to go stab the dude. And then when he got back to the ad seg, he said, "Yeah, dude disrespected me. Dude did this." But what he was really doing was getting away from his drug debts.
Right,
You know what
right.
I
That's what I
mean?
meant. Yeah.
So, but he was a killer. Story was a killer. So people feared him. He wasn't a small dude. He was tall. He was about 6'4", 220 pounds. He was a good sized dude, real healthy, kept himself in really good shape, and he was a killer. And you could see it in him. You could see it. He's one of those guys, you could look in his eyes, this dude's a killer. You got to be careful. I remember when he showed up in Sleeves Valley, the first thing I did was I called over to the yard and warned him. Say, hey, this guy's a killer. You know what I mean? But he's not just like, you can't just send him on a mission. He won't do it, right? You have to be careful. He's going to go run himself up in debt, and then he's going to move on somebody, right? So you be careful with that dude. Well, what had happened was the guy that had the yard, his name was Edgar. The guy that had the yard over there that was taking care of business for me over there, he gives me a call and says, "Hey man, this dude's causing problems." I said, "You need to get him now. Don't wait." Right?
Yeah.
Edgar waited. So Story and Rebel jumped on Edgar and killed him. In the process, had the other whites go kick off a war with the others, run over there and start taking off on the Samoans and the others and the Asians, right? Saying that there was some kind of debt between the whites and the others, and that the others weren't taking care of their business, right? None of that was true. But because Edgar was, tipped up, Story fucked himself off, right? Edgar had clout, so even though Edgar died, and sometimes murder takes precedence over clout. Sometimes you go, okay, he's a killer, let him stay. But when Story got kicked out of the hole after like 2 or 3 years, he's out of AdSeg, man, he didn't make the yard one moment. Four dudes went over there, him and Rebel. Literally, they hit him so hard in the neck, the first shot. He was dead within 30 seconds, you know. And I give him a little bit of credit, man. He went over to try to help his friend Rebel. He was actually got hit a couple of times and seen Rebel was on the ground getting stabbed, and he ran over there and tried to help him and just collapsed. But it cut his neck so far open that he just, within seconds, he bled out. I don't think it lasted a minute. And I'm telling you, this guy's whole neck was folded in half. And but that's when you cross the wrong, because Edgar's tipped up with the way higher ups. You know what I mean? So no matter how much violence you might exude, sometimes you cross that line, there's no coming back. You know what I mean? And unfortunately for Story, that's what happened. And unfortunately for the four guys involved, because they all got freaking life sentences. You know what I mean?
It sounds
But
like murder's like a thing that happens a lot in California.
76 just in 2 years in California, just the last 2 years, 76 murders in the state of California in the prison system. You know what I
When's the
mean?
last time a correctional officer was murdered?
The last one I remember, so just the other day, a pro officer got killed at the pro office. You know what I mean?
I
And
didn't
their
know about
correctional
that.
officers, yeah, there's a correction. So in Oakland, California, a guy walked into the pro office and killed his pro officer, shot him. You know what I mean? But that's outside of prison. Inside prison, I can't. There was a there was something that happened just a couple years ago. I can't really remember. I can't really remember like what it was, like all that. But when I was in there, there was a cop in Chino stabbed and killed. But it doesn't happen that often. I'll be honest. Very, very rarely does it happen. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Uh, Now, do they get stabbed? Sure. Matter of fact, before the Chino incidents, the cops weren't required to wear stab-proof vests. But after the Chino incident, it was a mandatory. You had to wear a stab-proof vest, you know. But even then, I think there was an officer killed who was, I think, beaten to death just a few years ago. I don't remember exactly, but there's been many times when they got rushed. I mean, one of the most the biggest incidents, or one of the most famous incidents, is when the blacks rushed into the program office in Calipatria, right? A bunch of guys ran in there, started stabbing up all the cops inside the program office, you know. And then that same thing took place with the Southerners in Tehachapi. They ran into the program office, started stabbing up the sergeants and stuff. A lot of times that's because of corruption.
Right.
You know what I mean, from the staff, right? You know, it's not about like we're all friends. You know, nobody's asking the cops to be your friend, right? Or vice versa. But sometimes you poke the bear too many times and the bear's going to bite back, you know? And oftentimes that's usually what it was. And I'm not saying that it happened all the time. There was times when, you know, unprovoked. Thing that I used to piss me off a lot was when the cool cop got his ass whooped, right? Or
Yeah, I know.
stabbed
I
up.
used to hate when we'd have a cool cop work the dorm and then people would constantly just try him over and eventually they make him a shitty cop. I used to
Yeah.
hate that shit.
Yeah, well, it was always the cool cop that got his ass whooped too, right?
Yeah.
So it was like you're mad at this other cop who's a jerk, but because you can't get to him, you go get with this other one. And to me, I was like, man, because it turns that dude
Yeah.
into a dick, right? And I'm like, that to me it didn't make any sense. Get the guy you're mad at. Don't get the guy because the guy you're mad at is still going to start causing problems.
Right.
You know,
Yeah, they're
or he's gonna
picking
make
their
it worse.
fights.
Yeah, you know what I mean. So it always bothered me. You know, the, we talk about yard dynamics. You know what I mean? When it was good, man. I'm not gonna lie. There was times on the yard where we bring out buckets of freaking wine or pruno, whatever you want to call it, right? We call it wine. We bring buckets, 5-gallon buckets out to the yard and play baseball with the Southerners, bro. You know what I mean? Basically, freaking getting drunk and playing softball and shit like that, right? And it was fun, right? It was like that moment that everybody let down their guard and just had fun and just were human for that moment, right? It didn't happen all the time, but it happened sometimes, and those times were the times that we all kind of got along. Um,
It's weird how that happens, right?
yeah, you know what I mean? Because I often tell people, like, I've tried to describe it. I say you take 5 warring factions from around the world, right, and you put them all in one yard, right, and then there's this tentative peace, right? It's there, but it's easily broken, man, and it's always on edge. It's always walking that line, right? And there's this constant push and struggle. With High Desert, one of the things that made High Desert such a terrible place was in the very beginning, there was nothing set up. They just stuck a bunch of people on the yard. Now we're fighting for whose pull-up bars or whose weight, because we still have weight piles back then. Who's going to use these weight piles? Who's going to hang out at what tables? What side of the basketball court was going to be ours? And nobody wanted to make an agreement. Everybody wanted to fight over it. You know what I mean? And so that created this huge dynamic, and it stayed there. It For some reason, High Desert has always been and always will. And Salinas Valley is still one of, and I say this, probably one of the most corrupt prisons that I remember when I was doing my time. And but corrupt in as far as monetary corrupt, right?
Right.
And I think that had a lot to do with a lot of the cops that were brand new. And then they lived in a county where it was super expensive to live there. But yet they're brand new cops and they're only making like 60 grand a year. It's hard to find an apartment that you can pay for, you know what I mean, with that kind
Right.
of money in that area, right? So I think that had a lot to do with it. And then they're coming in and they're easily manipulated. They hear all these stories and stuff like that, and they're supposed to be told, don't fall for it. But man, you make friends with cops, man, and they'll bring you anything a lot of times, especially younger cops, or especially cops who have um sympathy for you, and or your situation. So, and then that's what you do. You try to. I used to tell people all the time, find out what their vice is, and you can get them bring you anything. You know what I mean? Just find out what their vice is, and then hand them stuff. Um,
Did you ever
but
have like a cop that was doing it directly for you?
yeah, I mean for years,
Oh, that
and
was the chick, right?
There was a chick, yeah, in Kurt Valley that I was having an affair with, and she would do whatever I asked her. And if she watches this, bash, she's gonna be pissed, right?
Are you still
But
talking to her?
no, I haven't talked to her since after, so she got snatched up by the investigative services unit, and then so she could have came back to work, but because they didn't bust her with anything, but
Well,
she
how'd you
claimed.
scoop her up, man?
You know what's funny? It just happened, bro. I went into this program. I used to have super long hair down to my ass, right? Really long hair. I used to keep it, tied up real tight. I just happened to walk in one day. I just taken a shower and my hair was out. And I walked into the classroom and she seen me, right? And then she turned ghost white, took off running. I was like, what the fuck? This is my first day in that class. So I was like, I don't know what's wrong with this lady, but she's weird, right? And then later on, she kept coming by and looking at me and then taking off, looking at me taking off. So a couple of days went by. I hit her up. I say, "Hey man, did I do something to offend you? What's going on?" And she goes, "No." She goes, "Don't worry about it." She kind of, she was like talking to me made her nervous,
Right.
right? And so, but not like she was attracted. I didn't feel that at all at first. But then
You
later
thought
on,
she
she
was
told me,
scared?
yeah, I thought she was scared of me. I was a big guy. I was about 240, pretty ripped up,
Right, right.
and I was like, man, what's wrong with this chick, right? And then finally she pulls me up and she goes, "You look just like my husband who passed away." You know
Uh,
what I mean? Like she goes, "I thought it was him walking around that corner." You know what I mean? She
damn.
goes, "That's why I was like," so I started rapping to her about that, right? I got into her with that and we just started talking. Well, then one day she had an issue with a black guy touching her, right? And she didn't want like touching her butt. And so she came to me. She knew I had some authority. And I said, "Look, I can't go to the blacks and tell them to not fuck with you. I can't because you don't fall under the umbrella of protection from the WUPA unless you're doing something for us." You know what I mean? So she's
It's
like, "Well,
savage.
what do you want me to do?" Right? And I'm like,
Well, here's your
"Well,
list. I'll see you tomorrow.
yeah, pretty much, right? Pretty much." It kind of went. That's the short version of it, right? As I went to her and I said, "Here," and then she tried to bring me stamps. I said, "I can get stamps sent in the mail." You know what I mean? What the fuck am I gonna do with stamps, right? So she started bringing me like cigarettes, right? And at the time, California didn't allow people to smoke. Cigarettes is a consumable, something you can sell, something you can make money. So when I accepted that, I went over to the blacks and I said, "Hey, she's under our protection." You know what I mean? And they were like, "Well, homeboy said." I go, "I don't care what homeboy said." You know what I mean? From this point forward, any move you make on this chick is going to be a direct violation against us, and we're going to have to handle this. And they were like, and I went to a black that I knew really well, that I had done a lot of time with. He respected me. And, he told Homeboy to back off. Homeboy didn't back off. He ended up getting beat down, you know? And then after that, I think that kind of like turned her on. You know what I mean? Because after that, she started bringing me cell phones and drugs and she would like, we'd talk on the phones and she was an ugly ass woman, man. And I don't mean that disrespectfully, but she
But
wasn't
it
a
is what
very
it is.
attractive woman, right? And
Yeah.
so I'm like, "Yeah, baby, I love you," and all that stuff. And she was doing whatever. But there was this one guy named Hazard. I'm using his name on purpose, right? Because he's an ass. But Hazard, right, found it. So I was bringing in these phones with me and a friend of mine, and I was having him bring them back to the building because we had to go through a work change metal detector. So we were stuffing them in the trash, walking through the work change, dropping off the trash, and then going back through and stripping out. Well, freaking Hazard finds out about this shit, and he hits me up one day about. I think I told you about it, man. He was like some weird dude talking about
Oh, yeah.
all yeah, cell phones and bestiality porn and all sorts of weird shit
Yeah.
that he's doing.
So that's crazy for the people that haven't heard this. So you're in prison and this guy just approaches you and he starts telling you about how he's into watching like
Well,
donkeys fuck chicks and stuff.
yeah, some weird shit. So here's what happened.
What
I
the
had a cell phone that I didn't even know how to turn on. I'd been in prison my whole life, right? So I'm pushing all these buttons on his phone and nothing's happening. So I'm trying to figure out who can help me. Well, this dude just came in from the street, so I'm thinking he knows how to turn the phone on. So I start talking to him about it. Say, "How do you do it?" I guess you got to hold the button down. I didn't know that. Right? I'm pushing it, but it's not doing nothing.
Right,
Right?
right.
So he tells me, "Yeah, you got to hold it down." So I held it down, turned on, whatever. Well, he just starts telling me these stories about how when he's on the streets, how he's juggling cell phones, doing crank and watching bestiality porn, bro. And I'm like, what the fuck's wrong with this dude? Right. So
Yeah.
I just like, whatever. He gave me the information I needed. I moved on. And then, but he started using dope and he started like acting weird. And I stopped talking to him because every single time I had a conversation with the dude, he wanted to bring up all that weird shit. And I never used drugs, so I don't understand what the hell he's talking about. I don't.
You
It's
don't
weird to
speak
me,
that
right?
language.
I don't, right? So I would split, and then I stopped talking to him altogether. Right? I'd avoid him and shit, right? And one day he hits me up. He's like, "Hey, man, you haven't talked to me in a long time. You mad at me?" I go, "No, I just don't understand. Every time you have a conversation, man, it's about bestiality, porn, fucking dope, and juggling cell phones." I said, "So we just don't have nothing in common, bro. I mean, you're good." And he turned around and PC'd up and told on me for having that chick on my team. And I was just like, but he got paranoid over the dope. You know what I mean? And I knew when he left, it was on and cracking, dude. I said, as soon as he left, I was like, oh shit, I gotta get rid of everything. And
Did you ever
we
get
called
him?
up. I didn't get a chance. He PC'd up, man, and I never even seen him again after. I
So
never even
once
heard of him.
somebody PCs up in Cali, then they are good. Like you can't get them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it depends, bro. I tell people this too, man. It depends. When you go over to those PC yards, there's a whole nother dynamic over there,
Oh, I
right? And
bet.
if you're a piece of shit in real life, you're gonna be a piece of shit over there too, and they're gonna get you. And then there's no running from it at that point. You know what I mean?
Right.
So if you're one of those guys that just has that piece of shit nature, you're gonna be a piece of shit no matter where you go. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? And they're
Facts.
gonna get you over there just as much, right? Because they got their own prison gang dynamic over there. You know what I mean? And you probably watch, it's weird as people drop out from one prison gang to join another, and it's weird. But
See,
they
that's
do it,
what's
man.
crazy is the SNY in Cali sounds like the GP in Florida. Anything goes, man, in Florida. Like there's not really any type of structure. Like you can, I
Yeah.
mean,
I'm starting a new YouTube channel. Hopefully, we start posting videos next week. Called Cell Block 64 because we like to keep it clean. And for those of you who've been to Cali prison, you know what Cell Block 64 is. We spell it, CELLBLCK, six and the number 64. There's four of us, a northerner, a southerner, a black, and myself. We're going to talk about the real life prison, California prison system, what's going on now, what's going on then, because we want to keep it clean. We see a lot of BS online about people telling stories. Some of those stories just ain't true. And Wes Watson, I'm calling him out. A lot of that shit he said ain't true. A lot of it is, but he didn't do it. You know what I mean? So,
right.
it's not about what we did and what we didn't do. It's about getting our life. You know what I mean? And let everybody know the real story. You don't have to lie. It's bad enough without lying.
I know you
You know what I
really
mean?
don't, bro. You don't have to make
You don't.
anything up now. Everything is so crazy in this life.
Yeah.
It's
It's easy
nuts.
to prove. It's easy to prove, man. There's enough people on here that can prove and disprove it. You know
Right.
what I mean?
Right.
So I don't
Exactly.
understand why anybody even does that.
So when
But
I did want to ask you, after doing 28 years, man, and getting out now and being in society and checking out YouTube and seeing everything that's going on, like, what are your thoughts about everything?
I think like just like in prison, everybody's got to hustle, man. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? And I think that's what YouTube is. It's a hustle for people. I'm going to try it my damn self. Why not? Right. Um, I not only do I have a story to tell, but I believe that, I have valuable information to provide others. Um, I work in the self-help community now, rehabilitation community. I do a lot of that stuff. And my goal is to keep as many people out of prison, right? From going back, right? So, that's what I do for a living, actually. However, it's weird out here, but it's nice. You know what I mean? The worst day out here is still better than the best day in there. You know what I mean?
Facts.
I just got my
Yeah.
truck stolen. We were talking about that earlier, right?
I know that's
And it's still
crazy,
better
man.
than being in prison, man. I mean, stole my shit last night, man. So it's still better than being in prison. I could put a smile on my face, man, and just suck it up. I'm still pissed, but
And
move forward.
also about your YouTube channel, I'll put the link to that in the description of this video. So if you guys are watching this video, if you can, he's starting a new channel, go ahead and subscribe to it. And just give him some support. We also might be bringing and doing another live with the four gentlemen he's talking about. And then you guys could join the live. When I find out the date, I'll definitely post it up on the channel so you guys will know when it is. So if you have any questions or just want to stop by and say what's up, you can do that too. Do you have anything else you want to share, Tommy?
Man, just thank you for everything, man. And if you ever want to interview again, let me know.
Okay.
It's not about coming up with stuff. It's about, sometimes you just forget, right? Or,
No, yeah,
it doesn't
facts.
come up in conversation. There's so much stuff happened over a period of 30 years, that,
Yeah.
we could have conversations about it for months. you know.
All right, man. Well, I appreciate you coming on. Like I said, if you're new, hit that subscribe button and turn your post notifications on so every time I do drop content, you can hear it first. And with that, this is DOC TV Unleashed, and we're out.